Welcome to the conservative intellectual tradition in America. Today we're going to be talking about the end of big government. We're going to be looking at the economic consensus that developed between the left and the right in American politics, as well as their differences. We're going to look at the Clinton administration's economic policy and the triumph of supply-side economics and the repudiation of Keynesian economics. Our guest lecturer today is Dr. Daniel J. Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell's illustrious career began in the United States Senate, working for Oregon Senator Bob Packwood. Mitchell left that position in 1990 to join the Heritage Foundation, focusing on tax policy issues, restraining the size of government, and income tax reform. In 2007, Dr. Mitchell joined the Cato Institute as a senior fellow, where he directs efforts on tax policy and issues such as the flat tax and international tax competition. In 2000, he co-founded the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. That's an organization formed to protect the United States in international tax competition. He's the author of Tax Revolution, The Rise of Tax Competition, and The Battle to Defend It with Chris Edwards. And his work has been published in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Forbes, National Review, numerous other publications, as well as numerous law reviews. And he's even been published in Playboy magazine. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel J. Mitchell. Dan?
Thank you very much. I was actually published in a German edition of Playboy. I don't read German, so all I can do is look at the pictures, I'm afraid. Mallory's a pretty smart guy. He's teaching a class, but getting other people to come in and do all the work. So I definitely want to aspire to do exactly what he's doing. My job today is to cover something that normally should take months and months of seminar analysis. We're going to try to cover the entire history of economics as it relates to public policy and do it all in a 1-hour time period. So we're going to necessarily be just touching on lots of issues in a very brief period of time. Let me start by explaining a little bit about economic growth, because that's really what this discussion is all about. And if you want to know what causes economic growth, there's definitely a consensus on this. Everyone agrees that the way you get economic growth is with the two factors of production, capital and labor. And if you want more economic output in your economy, you want people to have higher living standards, you really have 4 things that you can do. You can provide more labor to the economy, you can provide more capital to the economy, or you can utilize the existing labor more efficiently, or you can utilize the existing capital more efficiently. But that's it. There are no other factors of production. Everything that you think about there that might lead to economic growth is in some way tied to those 2 factors of production. But here's the key thing about how you mix those factors of production, where government policy enters into the discussion. You have these 2 ingredients, capital and labor. Think of it like you're making a cake. Who is the chef? How do those 2 ingredients, capital and labor, get mixed together? Is your chef the private sector, broadly speaking? Are you relying on people like Steve Jobs to be the chef who's mixing the capital and labor together? Or are you relying on the political class to do it? Are you relying on central planners in Washington? Are you relying on politicians in a national capital? I mean, who's the person who is actually mixing the capital and labor together, and what are the implications of those decisions for economic prosperity? And in some sense, this is the theme that will run through the entire hour of remarks, is figuring out what is the best way to make sure that we get the maximum output for the given amounts and the efficiency levels of capital and labor that are in the economy. And it does matter, because economic growth over time makes a big difference in terms of the prosperity of your people. Here are a couple of numbers. If your economy grows 7% a year, you double your GDP. It's a simple mathematical formula. You double your GDP in 10 years. If your economy grows 1% a year, you double your GDP in 70 years. And think about it this way. You look at high-growth tiger economies, some of the Baltic nations like Estonia, Ireland back in the 90s and last decade, Hong Kong over 50, 60 years. You look at these economies that grow 5, 6, 7% a year, and you can see by looking at the long-run data from places like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, so on and so forth, you can see how these countries were literally within at least our parents' lifetimes, these were very poor jurisdictions that became much more prosperous because they managed to have sustained, rapid rates of economic growth for multi-year periods. On the other hand, you look at, say, some of the European economies that are stagnating and in trouble right now, and if they have 0% growth or 1% growth or only 2% growth for a period of several decades, yeah, maybe they're still growing, but they're falling behind compared to the rest of the world. And I suppose if I was to get you to understand one thing from this lecture, or remember one thing when you're thinking about public policy, long-term trend lines are critical. If an economy is growing 1% a year over the long run, doesn't matter where it starts. Sooner or later, it's going to fall behind a country growing 4, 5, 6% a year. And of course, if one country starts out richer than the other and has that 4, 5, 6% growth, while another country has 1% growth, then obviously the country with 1% growth is going to fall farther and farther and farther behind. Another way to think about it, just in terms of your own household, imagine how much better off, presumably, at least if you're average, how much better off you are compared to your grandparents, and how much better off your grandparents are than their grandparents before then. And that is all simply a function of how much economic growth there is in a society. And just by way of background, the U.S., for the last 100-plus years, we've been averaging about 3% real growth. And what do I mean by real growth? Is that as opposed to fake growth? No, it's real growth in the sense that it's adjusted for inflation. We might have 3 times as much income as our grandparents, or 4 times as much, but that's in nominal dollars. You want to measure it in real dollars because that actually measures how much more purchasing power you have compared to your ancestors, or how much purchasing power, what the living standards are of the average American today versus 30 years ago, 60 years ago, so on and so forth. And so we've had this adjusted for inflation, 3% economic growth, really going back to about 1870. It's amazing. If you chart the trend line and then you chart actual economic growth, the actual economic growth always oscillates around that 3% line. And so the whole question is there something that we could be doing to get more of the, say, 5% growth that you see in Hong Kong and Singapore? And are there things that we should be doing to avoid, the 1% growth that you get in a country like Italy? And a lot of this whole discussion that I'm going to be talking about is what is the role of public policy in determining why some countries have faster economic growth, better economic performance than other countries. And I suppose the way to start in talking about this is to look at these different indexes of economic freedom. The Fraser Institute in Canada publishes something called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. My old employers at the Heritage Foundation published something called the Index of Economic Freedom. But you also have the World Economic Forum does their Global Competitiveness Report. And if you look at all these different measures that are out there, you'll find that they're very, very similar. And you can actually break down the building blocks of economic prosperity into 5 basic categories. And they are rule of law, trade, regulation, monetary policy, and fiscal policy. Now, I'm a fiscal policy economist, so the latter part of my lecture will mostly focus on the role of taxes and spending and things like that. But if you look at these indexes, fiscal policy is only 20% of a nation's grade. Matter of fact, all these 5 categories, roughly speaking, are responsible for 20% of how a nation performs economically. And the way that I think about it, that I think is very helpful, is that the first one I mentioned, rule of law. And rule of law isn't just rule of law. It's property rights. It's the legal system. It's the presence of corruption versus honest government. There's a whole series of institutional structures that, in some sense, serve as the foundation for an economy. If you don't have those fundamentally sound and honest institutions in your government, and I'm not saying they have to be perfect, but at least you want to be on the right side of the ledger on these things. If you have basically honest rule of law, legal system, court structure, honest policing, non-corrupt government, you don't have to pay bribes to do things and stuff like that. If you have that structure correct, then you build a house upon it of economic policy. But if you don't get that foundation right, it doesn't matter really what sort of house you build upon the foundation, because the foundation isn't going to be very strong. And so when you think about, for instance, why are so many countries in the developing world, why do they stay poor? Well, it's not because they have big bloated governments, because usually they don't. It's not because they have heavy regulation, although oftentimes that's a problem. The real problem in the developing world is that they don't have the right institutions. And without the right institutions, I mean, think about it. Remember, what gives us economic growth? Capital and labor, those two major ingredients. People who put capital at work in the economy put capital at work because they expect deferred benefits. When you invest, generally speaking, you're not making money the first year. You're hoping to make money down the road. Well, how likely are you to invest in an economy where you can't trust those structures, those institutions of government to treat you fairly? So if you want the capital to be mixed with the labor in your economy, and you have to have both. I mean, if you don't have both, then you might as well just be a hunter, gatherer, forager in the Stone Age. You need capital to enable you to produce more, to have good living standards. And the problem in the developing world is that that fundamental foundational issue of the rule of law, property rights, honest government, so on and so forth, that's usually what's missing. We're lucky in the Western world. We're lucky in the Western world that even if you're in a big high-tax European welfare state, for the most part, and again, there's degrees of how well countries satisfy these tests, but for the most part, in the Western world, they do satisfy these basic conditions. So that's the rule of law. Let's now look at monetary policy, trade policy, regulation, and fiscal policy. And let's take monetary policy first, because if you were to look at one issue where governments are most likely to throw an economy off the tracks, almost always you will find monetary policy somehow involved. You look at some of the major dislocations in our economy's history. You look back at the Great Depression, you look back at the 1970s, you look at the recent financial crisis, and almost always you find a situation where the Federal Reserve engaged in a boom-bust policy where initially they had a period of too much monetary creation. They created too much liquidity in the economy, and then when they realized that they had made a mistake, they pulled back. And unfortunately, the very act of creating too much money inevitably means that they have to pull back and, in effect, bakes into the cake some sort of economic dislocation. It can take the form of a financial crisis. It can take the form of the 1970 stagflation. It can be something like the Great Depression. And I'm not implying that there's any time one single explanation for these issues. You look at the Great Depression, and yes, maybe monetary policy was a triggering factor in the Great Depression, but then you had protectionism with the Smoot-Hawley tariff. You had Hoover raising the income tax rates from 25% to 63%. You had a doubling of the burden of federal spending. You had all sorts of government interest. So anytime you're looking at a period in our economic history, keep in mind you have these five big factors, which of course all sorts of sub-indices inside those five big factors, and each of those big factors is responsible for 20%. But again, the monetary 20%, you don't notice it when it's going well. Because, and also you don't notice rule of law if it's going well. It's something in the background of an economy, enabling an economy to function smoothly. If your money is stable, if the purchasing power is stable, if there's no efforts by the politicians to tinker and use monetary policy for short-term jiggering of the economy, you don't notice it. Just like you don't notice if you're honest, sound government and rule of law. It gives you an environment in which you can function. You notice if you're in Argentina and inflation's 30%. You notice if you're in Zimbabwe and you have hyperinflation. Yes, then you notice monetary policy. Just like if you're in some developing country where you can't open a business without paying bribes to 10 different people in 10 different government departments, then you notice the rule of law is missing. Or you notice if you're an investor, all of a sudden the government expropriates your property and you have no access to an honest court system, then you notice that the rule of law isn't there. But the rule of law is the foundation. You ideally never notice it because it's being done right. And monetary policy is sort of the oil in the engine of the economy. You only notice it if all of a sudden your engine freezes up and you have a big problem. So that's really the way to think about monetary policy. Let's talk a little bit about trade. This is one area where I think the title of my speech definitely applies, which is whether there's a consensus. Almost everybody today, outside of maybe a few exceptions, almost everybody today understands that free trade is a good idea. You can go all the way back to Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. You can go back even before then. And the notion that the bigger your market is, the more you're able to specialize. These are things, when we trade with each other, we become richer. Imagine, let's be very simplistic about it. Imagine if all of us were responsible for growing our own food, producing our own clothing, building our own house. We'd obviously be a lot poorer because none of us can be good at all those things. We're not able to specialize. We're not able to utilize the efficient allocation of labor and capital. And so trade is a very good thing. It used to be that governments were very protectionist, especially in the pre-World War II era. One of the big factors in the Great Depression was protectionism with the Smoot-Hawley tariff. But free trade, really, you'd go back to England in the mid-1800s. When you really began to develop the notion that free trade as an economic policy was a very good idea. I don't know if you've had history and you've read about the Corn Laws and things like that, more detail than we want to get into here. But of course, Adam Smith wrote his Wealth of Nations back in 1776, but it took a while for that to seep into the political system, into the consciousness of policymakers. They began to understand that protectionism necessarily made an economy poorer, and as free trade began to take off, first with England as an island trading nation, then, of course, everyone backslid, not everyone, but most everyone backslid with the Smoot-Hawley tariff and other protectionist initiatives around the world. But then, after World War II, there was a very conscious decision on the part of policymakers. They saw how world trade collapsed by about 2/3 with the protectionism of the 1930s. Of course, there was also a depression, so that would have necessarily reduced world trade as well. But the policymakers learned a very big lesson. When you put in place protectionism, you're going to make your economy poorer. And so one area where there definitely has been a consensus, and for the most part I think there's a consensus that inflation's a bad idea, and there's a consensus that rule of law is a good idea. So these are some areas where there has been a consensus that you want to try to move government out of the way so people can trade freely with each other, so economies can focus on the things where they are the most efficient. And the logic of trade and the logic of free trade, to be more specific, it's the same as it makes sense for there to be free trade between South Carolina and North Carolina. That's the exact same argument that there should be free trade between the U.S. and Canada. Or it's the exact same argument as there should be free trade between you and the local supermarket. You don't want government hindering people in the economy, whether it's labor, whether it's consumers, whether it's capitalists. You don't want the government hindering what is the most efficient and effective decision for people to make to improve their living standards. So trade's a big success story. Let's look now at the last two issues where the consensus isn't quite as strong. Let's look at regulation. The simple way of thinking about regulation, it's an area where the government allegedly steps in to correct what is arguably supposed to be a market failure, or to protect some sort of health and safety goal. Market failure would be something like pollution. If there's no regulation, I set up some sort of chemical factory to produce something. I might, if I was not a very ethical person, decide, okay, I'm just going to dump some toxic chemicals in the river that runs behind my factory. Now, in theory, in the era before regulation, the tort system protected against that because people would say, wait, I live downstream, you're doing me damage, you go to court. But the tort system was viewed as, I guess, an inefficient way of doing those things. And so that's when we began to have regulation in terms of addressing things like that. But you also have regulation in terms of things like basic safety. You have a school zone. Are you going to have a speed limit in front of the school zone? If you're going to have a speed limit, what's it going to be? Is it going to be 5 miles an hour? Is it going to be 50 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour? And so those are the decisions that people have to make when you're looking at the regulatory apparatus. And one of the most common things that you should have, and generally speaking, this is a consensus. Nobody's going to argue with this notion. What you should have is cost-benefit analysis. Now, that sounds very simple, and it is, of course, actually a simple concept, but how does it actually work? That's where things get more challenging. Everyone presumably agrees there should be speed limits. I gave the example of a school zone, but let's talk about an interstate highway. Right now, I don't know how many deaths there are on the road every year, but there's tens of thousands of deaths on the road. We could eliminate all auto fatalities by having national speed limits of 5 miles an hour. But would that make sense? That the cost of putting in place, even though there's a very clear benefit, we would save tens of thousands of lives every year by having 5 mile an hour national speed limits. We don't do that because we recognize on the other side of that regulation is a very, very high cost in terms of taking forever to get places and all the additional costs that would impose upon the economy. And so in various ways, different governments, it used to be we had a national speed limit, but now thankfully we're back to more of a federal system on that approach. Each state looks at, okay, what is our traffic density, what are the driving patterns, what are our enforcement capabilities, and they make a cost-benefit trade-off. And the same thing exists in all sorts of ways. There's actually a division of the Office of Management and Budget in Washington. That division is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. At least, I know it's OIRA. I think I have the 4 words right. But OIRA, one of their responsibilities is to sort of be the regulatory overseer of all the different government agencies that are putting out different regulations. And one of the things that they're always looking for is what is the cost-benefit analysis. Agencies say, okay, we want to do X. We want to create a national speed limit of 5 miles per hour because our job is to protect, is to reduce highway fatalities. But then someone like OIRA is sort of the adult oversight saying, well, wait, but you guys are only looking at one side of the equation. You're looking at the reduction in highway fatalities. We have to consider the overall economy. And so that's how, at least in theory, a lot of these decisions get made in Washington. And of course, some of this stuff becomes very controversial because not everyone makes the same assessments of what the costs of something are and what the benefits of something are. And then one other thing that you have to add to the equation then is that if your economy slows down and doesn't grow as fast, that has implications for the health and longevity of your population. There's very clear relationships in the literature between the income of a country and the lifespan of its people. If you're a very poor nation, your lifespan could be as little as, it could be under 50 years. But if you're in a very wealthy nation, lifespans are approaching 80 years. So if you pass a very expensive regulation that harms the economy, even though you might be saying, well, we're going to save, according to the scientific literature, we're going to save 14 lives by doing this very expensive regulation. But if that very expensive regulation causes your GDP to be $100 million less, well, it turns out in the academic literature, and of course you ask 5 economists, you'll get 7 opinions, but in some of the academic literature, there's data showing that to the extent that government knocks, I think the last figure I saw was $6 billion off your economic output, that causes 1 premature death. That's the relationship over time through an economy. $6 million less, at least in this one study, of economic output means 1 premature death. And most regulations are governed by looking at how can we prevent a premature death. Like we want to limit the sulfur dioxide that comes out of a certain coal plants or whatever it is, because we think that will avert 17 premature deaths because of cancer rates and things like that. That's the kind of that's the weeds they get into when they're trying to do these types of things. But if you're reducing, say, 17 deaths at a cost of $35 million each, but $6 million of less economic output leads to a premature death according to other research, you have to somehow bring those two things together and figure out, okay, how much are we going to sacrifice in terms of economic output, and what would the cost be in terms of premature deaths looking at it that way versus just looking at, okay, we're going to reduce sulfur dioxide or some pollutant by this much and we think it's going to have a beneficial effect on health. So with regulation, the way to think about it, it's always trade-offs. You're never going to reduce risk in a society. Every time you wake up, you cross the street, you get in a car, you fly in a plane. Peanut butter How many people know that peanut butter is a carcinogen that the federal government looks at and does measures? You eat a certain amount of peanut butter, it increases in some infinitesimal way. Every peanut butter sandwich you eat increases your risk of cancer. Now, obviously, a lot less than every cigarette you might smoke, but that's what regulatory issues are all about. It's very complex. In theory, it should be very science-oriented, and you should be trying to figure out what are the costs versus what are the benefits. Now that's the way it should work. Oftentimes, we get regulations that arguably don't have any economic benefit, where the government will do things like on a state level. They'll say, well, you can't be a florist unless you pass a government exam. You can't be an interior decorator without a government license. You can't sell a wooden casket. There are regulations in different states for funeral homes that you have to buy caskets to get cremated in. And of course, that's mostly because the casket building industry will lobby the state legislators to put in this requirement to buy a casket, even though if all that's happening is you're getting cremated, you probably don't really care that you're in a casket when the jets get turned on. And so in situations like this, you might have regulatory burdens imposed, even though you're not actually able to measure in any way a benefit. Unless, of course, you think it's a benefit that you're unjustly enriching the casket building industry or something like that. So when I talk about how, in theory, regulation should work, you then have to sort of move out of that theoretical world, which, of course, actually does apply to some extent in the real world. And then you want to look at the real world. How does regulation actually operate? And you see, in terms of the real-world operation of regulation, that oftentimes different industries will use the regulatory process to try to obtain unearned wealth. And this is the theory George Stigler, the late George Stigler, he was one of the Nobel Prize winners at the University of Chicago, he entitled this regulatory capture, which is the government creates a regulatory agency. The regulatory agency is supposed to do certain good things for the economy, but of course, over time, the regulated industry figures out, hey, let's go ahead and use a lot of lobbying resources and make sure that we actually control that regulatory body so that that regulatory body can then pass rules that help the big, powerful companies in the industry. And that's oftentimes what you see, is that regulations wind up benefiting big companies at the expense of small companies. And why is that? Because if you're a big company, you already have a very big legal staff, accounting staff, compliance staff, and all these things. And so if there's some new regulation that, say, will cost every firm $10 million, if you're a big corporation, $10 million might be an asterisk in your budget. If you're a small competitor, $10 million may put you out of business. And so the regulation and how it works in the real world is often different than the theory. But I want to stress something. There is something very sound and legitimate in the theory. So even though at the Cato Institute we're considered a libertarian free market think tank, we have a very skeptical view of regulation, but it's a skeptical view of regulation in terms of in the real world how it operates, not regulation in the theoretical world of how it should operate, where you do an honest and legitimate assessment of trying to balance costs and benefits and looking at risks in the economy. And also, I should say, it goes beyond economics, because there are certain things where hang gliding presumably is a very hazardous hobby to undertake. And I suppose if you just want to be, some sort of actuary or accountant, you can say, well, that has almost negligible impact on our GDP, and look how many deaths it causes, or people who go skydiving and parachuting and things like that. Think of all the deaths this leads to a year, and it only contributes 0.0001% to our GDP, and so a regulator might decide, well, we want to ban that. But then you have to bring into factor in, well, there are other things that have to be part of your calculation. Simple human liberty and freedom. The ability to decide, I want to go out and try to surf 20-foot waves in California. I want to be a skin diver and take a risk of a shark attack. There are inherently dangerous things where the question is, should people have the freedom and liberty to engage in those activities? And in theory, if you just did a completely dispassionate cost-benefit analysis, you might say, no, people shouldn't be allowed to do that. And that really then gets into questions like you see in New York City. Mayor Bloomberg wants to ban restaurants from having salt and things like that. He just had some new decision where he wants to stop companies, or maybe it's restaurants, from contributing food to homeless shelters if the fat levels, the salt levels, and things like that are above a certain level. So isn't that wonderful? We'd rather have homeless people go hungry than, heaven forbid, there be a little bit too much salt in their food. But so these are some of the different issues that you raise when you're looking at regulation and how it works on the economy. Let's now shift to my bread and butter, which are fiscal issues. And I suppose when I say fiscal issues, we're really talking about three different things, and I'll break them down as I continue with this part of the discussion. We're talking about deficits and debt, we're talking about government spending, and then we're talking about the tax code. But before I break down those three things, let me go ahead and just walk through a very abbreviated fiscal history of the United States. Very, very abbreviated. Basically, from the founding of our country, for a good roughly 130, 170 years, depending on how you want to calculate it, we had limited government very much in the along the lines of what our founding fathers envisioned. You look at the U.S. Constitution, you look specifically at Article 1, Section 8, you'll see the enumerated powers of the federal government. It says the federal government, specifically Congress, has the power to levy and collect taxes, to do patent and copyright laws, to build post roads, to maintain a national defense. I think they specifically mentioned Army and Navy. They didn't quite envision an Air Force back then. But there are something like 19 or 20 different specific clauses in Article 1, Section 8. One thing you will not find in Article 1, Section 8 is the Department of Agriculture. You won't find a Department of Energy. You won't find a Department of Education. You won't find Social Security. You won't find Medicare. You won't find Medicaid. Most of what the federal government does today would probably cause the founding fathers to roll over in their graves, because Article 1, Section 8 is pretty clear. This is what you are allowed to do. And the rest of the Constitution is pretty clear. If you're not specifically given the authority and permission to do it, it's not the business of the federal government. So that system pretty much operated certainly through the 1700s, 1800s, into the 1900s. Probably the first hiccup was the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era, late 1800s, early 1900s, was primarily characterized by a change in the view of the role of government. Our founding fathers very clearly, read the Federalist Papers, read all the early writings. Matter of fact, the Cato Institute was named after letters from Cato, which were pamphlets done during the Revolutionary War. And all the analysis, all the writing, the spirit that animated the founding fathers was that government was a dangerous thing, and that the purpose originally of the Articles of Confederation, but then shortly thereafter the Constitution, the purpose of the Constitution was figuring out, okay, we need to have a government, but we don't trust government. I forget, was it Paine or Washington who had the quote about government is like fire, a dangerous servant, a fearful master, something like that. I don't have the quote right, but you get the idea. And the purpose of the Constitution was figuring out how can we fence in government and guarantee individual rights so that people didn't have to worry about this dangerous entity that throughout the history of the world was associated with oppression and tyranny and abuse. And so the founding fathers took this idea that government is a dangerous, risky thing. You need to have it because we haven't figured out how to have anarcho-capitalism yet. I actually went to graduate school with people who thought we could have it. We'd argue all day long about how national defense would be privately provided. So I was sort of considered a left-winger in the graduate department. But the founding fathers set in place this system that was designed to limit government. What characterized the Progressive Era was the notion that, hey, government's not a dangerous thing that we should curtail. It's a wonderful force for good, and if we sort of unchain government from the Constitution, we can therefore have government go out and start doing things to make the world a more wonderful place. And the one thing that coincided with the Progressive Era that basically enabled that process to begin was that wonderful day in 1913 when the income tax became permissible because the 16th Amendment was adopted. Now, I suppose, to be fair, a little bit of history. We did have an income tax between, I think it was 1863 and 1872. Came into place as part of financing the North in the Civil War. We then had an income tax adopted in 1894, but it was then an 1895 Supreme Court decision that said, this is not authorized by the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 does give you the ability to levy and collect taxes, but they had to be apportioned among the states, and obviously it's very difficult to design an income tax so that you're collecting a per capita similar amount from every state. So that pretty much killed the income tax. I'm an economist, not a lawyer. I'm sure it's much more detailed than that. But what happened is then the politicians put forward a proposed constitutional amendment, which obviously took 2/3 of both the House and Senate to get out of Congress, and then in 1913, 3/4 of the states ratified it. And what started out as a 14-page law with one 2-page tax form with a top tax rate of 7%, of course, has morphed into the lovely Internal Revenue Code that we all know and love today. So that was a very important point in time in terms of the fiscal and economic history of the United States. The next thing that happened that was fairly significant was the New Deal, because the New Deal is when we began to put in place some of the welfare state, particularly welfare and Social Security. The next big thing that happened was the Great Society, and the Great Society is when we got Medicare and Medicaid. This was during the 1960s. And then I suppose if we're going to look at recent history, and again, we're just doing this a 30,000-foot snapshot so we can get into some of the economics of deficit spending and taxes here. The next thing that happened is we had a 20-year period between 1980 and the end of the century where under both Reagan and Clinton, there was a consensus that government was too big and that the burden of government spending should shrink. And by and large, we sort of moved in that direction during the Reagan and Clinton years. But then we have this century, the Bush-Obama years, which are sort of the opposite of the Reagan-Clinton years, because we've seen a pretty constant expansion in the burden of government spending that more than erased all the progress that we made during the Reagan-Clinton years. Now, to put it in the context of the title of Is There a Consensus, this is the one area where I think there's not a consensus. Maybe there was a consensus during the Reagan-Clinton years about shrinking the burden of government, and then maybe there was a consensus, at least in Washington among politicians, to increase the burden of government during the Bush-Obama years. But a lot of the fiscal fights that we're now seeing in Washington are fights because there no longer is a consensus, because people are looking at these fiscal issues and fighting over what is the proper size, scope, and role of the federal government. And of course, adding to that, if instead of looking at history, we sort of look at future history, everyone is aware of the fact that because of the demographics of the population, because of the structure of the entitlement programs, the very same problems that we are looking at in Greece today are going to happen to the United States unless something changes. So that's a little bit about the history. Let's now look at these three big fiscal policy issues: deficits, spending, and taxes. When we're looking at deficits or debt, and just by way of definition, I'm sure you all know this, deficits are the annual borrowing that you do to finance government because you're spending more than you're collecting in revenue, and debt is simply the collection of all your past deficits that add up. The simple way of thinking about it is if you have a big credit card balance because of your past spending, that's like your debt. The amount that you're spending each month over what you're collecting each month, that would be your deficit. We have a deficit that is roughly 9% of GDP right now. We have a national debt that is, there's actually several ways of measuring the national debt. There's your gross public debt, there's your gross national debt, publicly held debt, then there's unfunded liabilities, which is more of an actuarial measure. But basically, we have an annual deficit of about 9% of GDP. We have a gross national debt of more than 100% of GDP. Our publicly held debt is more like, I think, 75% of GDP right now. But then if you're looking at the unfunded liabilities of the entitlement programs, then you're talking about, by some measures, 400, 500% of GDP. You start getting into, it's very difficult to measure because you have to do calculations of present value and what is your assumption on the interest rate when you're making that calculation. So it's a very amorphous and fuzzy way of trying to define things, but it's simply a measure of the fact that we've promised to spend this much in the future and we're only going to collect this much revenue. And how you measure that gap, it gets pretty complicated. When I look at deficits and debt, I suppose the number one thing I want to get across to people is that that is not the problem. That is the symptom of the problem. The problem that we have, as I'll talk about in the next section, is the burden of government spending, because government spending, regardless of how it's financed, is what diverts resources from the productive sector of the economy. the higher your level of government spending, the more the politicians are being the chefs who are mixing the capital and the labor, and the less resources you have in the private sector for entrepreneurs to mix the capital and the labor. Now, sometimes when I say that, people say, wait, that's wrong, because if you have deficits, you'll have high interest rates. Because what are interest rates? Interest rates are the price of borrowing. And if the government's borrowing more and more and more, we remember from our Economics 101 class, there are these supply and demand curves. And so the more government is borrowing, the more upward pressure that's going to put on the price of borrowing, and that's an interest rate. And I'm an economist. I believe in supply and demand curves. So I agree with that analysis. But here's the key thing. Just like it's very interesting and challenging to measure costs and benefits when you're looking at regulation, it's very interesting and challenging to measure what is the actual impact of government borrowing on the price of borrowing. And here's the example I use all the time. I go to McDonald's. I buy a McChicken sandwich for $1. That dollar menu is a pretty good deal. I'll even buy sometimes 3 McChicken sandwiches. In theory, my purchase of McChicken sandwiches at McDonald's is increasing the demand for McChicken sandwiches, which should put upward pressure on the price. But if my purchases of McChicken sandwiches are just a tiny drop in the bathtub, or maybe even a tiny drop in the lake of demand for McChicken sandwiches, then it's going to be very difficult to measure whether my McChicken purchases are having any effect on the price of McChicken sandwiches. And likewise, in a world capital market of tens of trillions of dollars, even very large amounts of borrowing by the U.S. government might not be enough to have a significant effect on interest rates. Now, the smart people in the audience are saying, well, hold on a second. Look at what's happened in Greece. Their interest rates have shot up. But the reason that interest rates in Greece have shot up is, yes, because they're borrowing too much, but what's driving the interest rate up is not the pressure on the supply and demand of credit in the global economy. It's an assessment on the part of international investors that we don't trust the Greek government to pay us back. That's what's driving the higher interest rates in places like Greece. That's why we're seeing interest rates on government debt and some of the other European economies begin to climb. That's why historically there are relatively high interest rates on government debt for developing countries, because these are the countries that have a greater history or greater likelihood of default. So it's the probability of default that is driving the high interest rates. It's not the demand of governments to borrow money causing interest rates economy-wide to rise. We have more government debt in the world today than ever before, and yet global interest rates are very, very low. Now, of course, like anything with economics, you always want to look at more than one factor. And the reason that interest rates are very low, it's not in spite of government borrowing. It's because the overall world economy is not that strong. There's a lot of capital in the world economy. So if there's not that much demand for private investment because governments are making policy mistakes that make it less likely you can earn a profit by investing, and if there's lots of capital and savings being provided, especially from the East Asian economies, that's going to affect the world interest rate. So that's why the cost of capital right now is very low, even though the burden of government borrowing, the demand by governments to borrow more money is at record levels. So yes, there are several factors going on with interest rates. I do think government borrowing puts upward pressure on interest rates, but I think the reason you see some countries with very high interest costs, it's all about the risk of default. It's not the supply and demand of capital available for government borrowing. Now, I should say that if you had someone from the Congressional Budget Office here giving this same presentation, they would make an argument, well, even if interest rates aren't high, government borrowing has a very negative effect on the economy because you are diverting capital from private uses to government uses. And I wouldn't disagree with that either. But then you start getting into questions about, is that the only thing that matters? And if you read some of the CBO analysis, they actually do act as if that's the only thing that matters. You look at some of the Congressional Budget Office research, and they will actually argue that higher tax rates are good for the economy. Why do they argue that higher tax rates are good for the economy? Because if you have higher tax rates, that's going to lead to less government borrowing, or maybe even a government surplus, which means that there's going to be more capital for the private sector, and that's going to lead to more economic growth. And I don't actually disagree with any of those links in the chain of reasoning, but To assume that tax rates in and of themselves don't discourage economic growth, I think it's a mistake. I think CBO is a little bit naive in assuming that if you raise taxes, that politicians will actually use the money to reduce deficits instead of just spend the money. So there's lots of problems with the CBO chain of reasoning, but there's also some truth to it. Obviously, at some level, too much government borrowing will get you in trouble. But again, I want to come back to what I said before, that it's the diversion of money from the productive sector of the economy by government spending, whether it's financed by borrowing or financed by taxes. That, I think, is what we want to look at. And I'll say one last thing about deficits and debt. There's a very influential book that came out recently, and there's lots of studies that are associated with it, saying that 90% of GDP is a critical level. When your government debt as a share of GDP gets above that level, then you begin to have very negative consequences for economic growth. That's obviously based on cross-country data, all aggregated together. I don't think it's a magic number. Japan has government debt of 200% of GDP. They haven't hit the brick wall yet. I think they will at some point because of their demographics, but they have 200% of debt as a share of GDP, and they're still surviving. After World War II, we had 125% of GDP government debt, and didn't stop us from growing. England was over 200% of GDP at the end of World War II. Didn't stop them from growing. On the other hand, Spain and Portugal have already gotten in trouble and required bailouts when they had government debt at about 65, 70% of GDP. So it really, 90% of GDP might be an average, but then you have to look at the characteristics of the country, because some countries will get in trouble at much lower levels. I guarantee you, Argentina would default well before it got to 90% of GDP, whereas a country like Japan, they might survive just fine until they get to 300% of GDP. It's hard to know. Let's now shift to spending. I've already mentioned that I think government spending is the most important variable to look at, because it is government spending that diverts the resources from the private sector. And the way to look at it is there are multiple ways to measure the cost of government spending. There's the diversion cost, which, as I mentioned, is the fact that resources, labor, and capital are now being allocated by politicians in Washington instead of entrepreneurs in the private sector. There's the extraction cost, and that's simply the measure of how you finance that government spending, taxes and borrowing. They both have specific negative costs on your economy. But then there are all sorts of other, what I would call micro effects. The extraction and the diversion costs, they apply to every single penny of government spending. But then you have to realize not all government spending is the same. And the way public finance economists look at this is they break down government spending by different categories. There's basic rule of law and institutional spending, providing the rule of law, the court system, and things like that. And those types of government spending are actually associated with good economic performance, because government is creating the environment that allows those chefs in the private sector to mix labor and capital without worried about theft, expropriation, invasion, and things like that. So core public goods of sound institutions, rule of law, and things like that, government spending on those things is associated with better economic performance. That's one category. Another category is physical and human capital. And this is sort of a mix. What are physical and human capital? Well, roads are an example of physical capital. What you guys are doing right here, getting an education, is an example of human capital. And those are things that we all understand, that we need to have a good physical infrastructure network, and we need to have an educated workforce to have a good growing economy. And these are things that governments generally do. Here's the problem, though. Governments usually do them very inefficiently. Yes, the interstate highway system gave us a good return on our dollar, but building bridges to nowhere gives us a very bad return on our dollar. What do governments tend to do more of today? They tend to do more bridges to nowhere, earmarks, pork barrel spending. And so even though human capital spending can be associated with better economic performance, if politicians are misusing their appropriations authority, physical capital spending is associated with worse economic performance. Human capital, another example. We spend more per capita than any country in the world other than Switzerland on education. And yet if you measure all the industrialized economies in the world, we have one of the worst performances. It turns out that our monopoly structure government school system is extraordinarily expensive and gets us a very, very low rate of return in exchange. You look at countries like the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden that have school choice systems. They spend a lot less. They get much, much better results per dollar or per euro or per kroner, whatever their unit of currency is. They're getting more bang for the buck. I mean, and this is true for anything you do. Depending on how good of a negotiator you are, you might go out and buy a new car for a great price. You may get ripped off. The problem with the way that government is providing physical and human capital, we're getting ripped off. We are paying a lot for all these things, and we're getting very, very poor results. So even though we know that physical and human capital spending are very important for an economy, the question is, how efficient is the government at providing them? So that's the second category. First category, institutions. Second category, physical and human capital. Then there are two other categories, transfer spending and consumption spending. And this is actually the vast majority of what government does, or at least what the federal government does. And all the academic research pretty much indicates that this type of spending is negatively associated with economic performance, because this is the type of spending that tells people don't work as much, the government will replace that income. Don't save and invest as much, the government will take care of you. This is the type of spending that has the inefficiency, the dependency. You also have spending on things like regulatory agencies. I mean, our budget for the Securities and Exchange Commission, I think, is less than $1 billion. But the cost of just one law alone, Sarbanes-Oxley, was like $1.5 billion, and that was just on one segment of the business community. So the amount of money we actually spend on a regulatory agency is trivial often to the amount of cost that that regulatory agency might be imposing on the economy. Now then, of course, you have to remember our discussion on regulation. You need to figure out, is the regulation efficient, inefficient, the cost-benefit structure, so on and so forth. And when you look at all these issues of government spending, one thing you find is there's something in the academic literature called a Ron curve. It's sort of like this. I'll talk a little bit later about the Laffer Curve. This is the spending version of the Laffer Curve. It says if government isn't spending anything, and isn't providing that rule of law, isn't providing infrastructure, human and physical capital, then you're going to have a very weak economy. So you need some government spending to enable your economy to grow, but then when government gets too big, then it bends downward, and more spending is associated with weaker economic performance. And I think the data is that at most, total government spending in your economy, once it exceeds 20% of GDP, it begins to be negatively related to prosperity. Right now, federal, state, and local, we're close to 40%. And I actually think the accurate data is more like 10% of GDP. We don't really have time to get into that because I can see we're running out. So I'm going to go quickly through a few other points. Keynesianism, stimulus. Here's the theory. Divide the class in half. Borrow all the money from people on this half of the room. Give it to people on this half of the room. Here's the question to determine whether you're qualified to be a member of Congress. Who thinks there's more money in the room? Nobody raised their hand. You're not qualified to be in the cabinet or to be in Washington at all. Keynesianism is the theory that you take money out of the right pocket of your economy, put it in the left pocket of your economy, and you're richer as a result. It doesn't work. It didn't work for Hoover and Roosevelt in the 30s. It didn't work for Japan in the 1990s. It didn't work for Bush in 2008. It didn't work for Obama in 2009. Keynesianism is simply an excuse that the politicians have come up with, I think, to enable them to do what they like doing anyhow, which is to spend money. Let's talk about taxes and try to do it all in just a few minutes here. The ideal tax system. Remember I said that not all government spending is created equal? It's the same thing for taxes. Not all taxes are created equal. Do you realize that the Hong Kong flat tax collects roughly the same amount of money as a share of GDP as the U.S. tax code? And yet, obviously, the Hong Kong flat tax is much less destructive to growth than the U.S. Internal Revenue Code. Hong Kong, nice, simple 15 or 16% flat tax. The entire tax code is less than 200 pages. We have this monstrosity of an Internal Revenue Code, 72,000 pages of law and regulation. We have pervasive double taxation between the capital gains tax, corporate income tax, double tax on dividends, and the death tax. A single dollar of income can be taxed 4 different times. Good public finance theory says that for any given amount of revenue you want to collect, you should have your rate as low as possible. You should not be double taxing savings and investment, because every single economic theory, even socialism and Marxism, they all agree that capital formation, again, we're back to that, the chef mixing capital and labor. If you don't have capital, labor is not going to be productive, and that's what determines the health, the prosperity, the vitality of your economy. And yet our tax system goes out of its way to penalize the provision of capital to the economy, almost as if we were deliberately designing a tax code to reduce our long-term growth rate. So we have this pervasive double taxation, and then that 72,000 pages of law and regulation, that's because we have a plethora, an array, a monstrosity, a Rube Goldberg system of loopholes, exemptions, exclusions, deductions, credits, shelters, so on and so forth, that winds up putting industrial policy into our system. In other words, the government, through the tax code, is being the chef trying to determine how labor and capital get allocated, and that necessarily means a less dynamic, less vital economy. And if you fix all the problems in the tax code, where you have the lowest possible rate, when you get rid of the double taxation, you get rid of the loopholes, what do you have? You have a flat tax. Or, to be more accurate, you have a single rate consumption-based tax system. Now, when public finance economists refer to consumption-based tax systems, they're really just referring to a tax system where income is taxed only one time. That's the consumption-based, sometimes called Fisher-Touré tax base. The other model of taxation, which unfortunately that we follow for the most part in Washington, is called the Hague-Simons tax base. And that's the principle that not only do you tax income, but you tax net worth as well. You tax changes in net worth. You tax transfers of net worth. And that's where all the double taxation, or a lot of the double taxation in the tax code exists. So if you want the right type of tax system where you collect revenue while doing the least amount of damage to the economy, a consumption-based tax system with a low rate is much better than a Hague-Simons system of double taxation with high rates. Now, this, of course, gets into issues like fairness. And fairness, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. Does fairness mean that you treat everyone equally? Or does fairness mean that you impose higher tax rates on people who are providing more output for the economy? There's a cost. If you decide to go with that latter definition of fairness, it means you are going to penalize the entrepreneurs, the investors, the people who tend to have the most bang for the buck. For every hour of labor they provide to the economy, they generate a much, much bigger amount of output. That's the value of marginal product in your labor economics classes. That's what determines how much your salary and wages are going to be in the long run, is how productive are you per hour worked? How much wealth can you generate for an economy? Now let me touch on a few other ideas about we talked about the theory of taxes. I mentioned the Laffer Curve before. This is simply the notion that tax rates at some point can become so high that they're self-defeating. And let me give you an example. And of course the theory, let me first give you the theory. At a 0% tax rate, how much money does the government collect? Nothing. At a 100% tax rate, how much money does the government collect? Nothing. Well, maybe there are a few genetic socialists out there who would still earn income if the government took 100% of it. But for the most part, 100% tax rate, no revenue for government. 0% tax rate, no revenue for government. Paul Krugman will agree with that. The real debate is, okay, where is that point on the Laffer curve where you have a revenue maximizing point, but more importantly, you also have a growth maximizing point? I don't want to maximize revenue for government. So I've never looked at the Laffer curve and thought, well, boy, if we could just have the tax rate exactly at this point, we could give those people in Washington the most possible amount of money to spend. But that's never been high. It's never even been low on my list of priorities to give them the maximum amount of money to spend. The growth maximizing tax rate, in effect, automatically comes from your look at the Ron curve and figuring out what is the growth maximizing size of government. If the growth maximizing size of government is 10% of GDP, then you necessarily flow down to your Laffer curve and you figure out what is the least destructive way of collecting taxes of 10% of GDP. Or maybe you think it's 20% of GDP. Maybe you think it's 5% of GDP. But you make your decision on what should government do. And of course, secondary to that, you figure out what level of government should do it. If you want to honor what the Founding Fathers had in mind, you have a very limited central government, which for much of our nation's history, the federal government only consumed 3% of GDP. Most government was then at the state and local level, and so you'd have a separate decision. How does the federal government collect revenue? How do state and local governments collect revenue? But in both cases, you presumably want them to decide, how can we collect revenues in a way that doesn't damage the economy? A couple of other issues that I want to touch on really fast. One is the issue of starve the beast. There's a big debate in Washington right now about whether taxes should be increased. We have this big pile of red ink. You can look at the data and you can see the reason that we have all this red ink is because government spending under Bush and Obama has exploded. If you look at taxes as a share of GDP, even without any tax increases, we're going to be above that historical average on the federal level of 18% of GDP. So I think there's a very strong argument that 100% of the problem is on the spending side, so why on earth would you want to have higher taxes? But then separate from that is the issue that if you decide to raise taxes, is that even capable of reducing the deficit? Because if it turns out that when you raise taxes, you simply encourage the politicians to spend more money, sort of the old joke about you don't give the keys to a liquor store to a bunch of alcoholics, then it turns out that raising taxes might actually make the fiscal situation worse, in part because they spend more money, but in part because of the Laffer Curve effects. Oh, we're going to raise taxes because we want more money, so we'll increase the tax rate this much. We think we'll get this much money, but in reality, you only get this much money, but they spent this much money because of the expectation of getting this much money. That's why if you look at the situation in Europe, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the burden of government in Europe was similar to what it was in the US. They kept raising taxes. They kept raising spending. And this is sort of the starve the beast, feed the beast theory. Does cutting taxes reduce the size of government? Well, during the Bush years, the answer is definitely no. So I wouldn't want to really argue strongly that starve the beast worked. But the separate side of the argument is feed the beast. And the evidence from Europe is every time they increase tax rates, when they put in the value-added taxes, which is their sort of European form of a national sales tax, what happened? Well, before the VAT, before the tax burden went up, you had Southern European economies with medium-sized governments and big deficits. You had Northern European economies with medium-sized governments and small deficits. Now they all have much higher tax burdens. They all have value-added taxes. And what do you find? Southern European economies with big governments and big deficits. Northern European economies with big governments and small deficits. All that's changed is they have higher taxes, which enabled, virtually speaking, a one-for-one trade-off of higher spending. So how you come down on the starve the beast, feed the beast debate will say a lot about whether or not you think it's appropriate to give the politicians in Washington more revenue. I mentioned the value-added tax. That's going to be a giant fight in Washington. Maybe not 1 year or 2 years from now, but somewhere in the next 5 or 10 years, there's going to be a major fight over whether we should have a value-added tax, and that really determines, in my mind, whether or not the politicians will have a giant new source, broad-based source of revenue, just like when they put in the income tax in 1913. Will they have another giant broad-based source of revenue that would enable us to sort of take that leap to the European level? Now, whether that's a good leap or a bad leap depends on your underlying philosophy. I personally think that would be a very unfortunate leap because we certainly see from what's happening in Europe now, why would we want to copy their fiscal policy? But the VAT, here's what a lot of people think. The VAT, and this is true, on a per dollar raised basis, the VAT does less damage to your economy than higher income tax rates. And so if you have a pessimistic view of life, and you think, well, no matter what, government's going to get bigger, and they're holding a gun to my head, they're going to demand more money from me, what's the least damaging way to give them more money? Well, it would be to give them a VAT. But then you have to factor into that discussion, does giving them a VAT enable a much, much bigger size of government? And of course, what we saw in Europe is that when they did the VATs, they used that as an excuse to raise income tax rates anyhow because they had to maintain the distribution of the tax burden because they had the left-wing definition of fairness. One last thing, and then I'll be quiet because we've run out of time. The current debate right now, just to bring everything we've talked about, the history, the theory, let's bring it all together to where the political process is right now in Washington. There's basically a fight between the kind of vision you have in the budget proposed by Congressman Paul Ryan, the chairman of the House Budget Committee, which deals with fundamental reform of the entitlement programs. You look at the long-run forecast for the U.S. government, we're going to be Greece plus some. Because of demographics and because of the way our entitlement programs are structured, the long-run forecast from the Congressional Budget Office is that government spending, and just to give you a little bit of numbers here, when Bill Clinton left office, federal government spending, the burden of that was 18.2% of GDP. Now we're 24% of GDP, a one-third increase in the aggregate burden of government in just 11, 12 years. By the time we get several decades out with the baby boom generation fully retired, we're talking 45% of GDP, maybe more, depending on which set of forecasts you believe. Obviously, if you have a doubling in the size of government, it means that we're going to be more like Italy, more like France, more like Spain, more like Greece, and that almost certainly is going to mean, because that chef of the political process is going to be much less efficient in terms of how they're allocating resources, how they're mixing labor and capital together, it's going to have very negative consequences on our GDP, on our employment levels. It's going to have very bad implications for the amount of red ink we have. It's going to have very bad implications for the type of tax system that we have. And you, as students, and I suppose this is a very pessimistic way to close down my remarks, but you, as students, just entering the workforce in the next year or two or whenever, during your prime earning years, are going to be precisely when we hit our period of Greek-style fiscal crisis. So maybe you want to start buying property in New Zealand or Costa Rica or something like that. But if we don't make good decisions now, and this is why I was saying we have the budget prepared by the House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan that restructures the entitlement programs. And then you have the vision of Bush and Obama of making government bigger, adding new entitlements. That vision basically, I think, puts us on a path to being Greece. But I want to be fair. It could also put us on the path to being Sweden. The Northern European economies do the welfare state in a much more responsible way. So it could be that if you want a welfare state, if that's where you ideologically are, then you better make sure that we wind up like Sweden, not like Greece. My personal fear is that our political system is much more likely to give us Greek-style results, not Swedish-style results. But if we happen to do the entitlement program reforms of block granting Medicaid to the states, restructuring Medicare so it's like a voucher system like members of Congress have for their own health care, if we wind up doing personal retirement accounts for Social Security like 30-plus countries around the world have done, then we can actually, this projection of ever-rising burden of government spending, we can actually bend that cost curve of government down. And the one thing I'll leave you with, the one way that I think is very appropriate to measure what is good fiscal policy is something that I very humbly named after myself. I call it Mitchell's Golden Rule. I want to sort of be like Art Laffer. He has the Laffer Curve. I figure this is my way of becoming famous. Mitchell's Golden Rule is very simple. Government spending should grow slower than the private economy. Notice that I'm not focusing on balancing the budget. Notice that I'm not talking about deficits and debt. I'm focusing on the underlying disease, not the symptom. If I go to a doctor and I have a headache, and it turns out that I have a brain tumor, I don't want the doctor to give me aspirin for my headache. I want him to deal with the tumor, because I want to actually solve the problem. Well, if you have an economy where the private sector is growing this fast and government's growing this fast, by the way, this right here is what's called a West Virginia PowerPoint slide. If the private economy is growing this fast, the government's growing this fast, sooner or later, it's a mathematical certainty you will balance your budget, even though that shouldn't be your first priority. Your first priority should be making sure you have government as a small share of the economy. If those two lines are reversed, and government is growing faster than the private economy, sooner or later, it's a mathematical certainty you become Greece. And that's really what our future is all about, because there's no way your taxes can ever keep up with the spending if your spending is growing faster than the private economy. Because what's the private economy? It's your tax base. So Greece got in trouble. The rest of Europe's gotten in trouble. The U.S. is on the path to trouble because we all suffer from the same problem of government growing faster than the private sector. We need to go back to Reagan and Clinton, where those lines were reversed. The private economy was growing faster than the government. That is the path to virtue. Thank you very much.